Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for March the 17th. Today, we are beginning a brand new read through the book of Leviticus. I appreciate you taking the time to tune in today and to read along with me in this third book of the Pentateuch, which is unfortunately probably a bit of a neglected portion of the Old Testament, specifically of the Pentateuch. I know I've heard preachers joke about a lot, and people get really excited about a daily Bible reading where they're going to read throughout the Bible this year, and they put in a great deal of effort. They're excited as they begin reading through Genesis. They breeze through that. They have all the really cool stuff that takes place in Exodus. They breeze through that too. And then they get to Leviticus, and it's like the effort comes to a grinding halt because, man, this can be a tough read. It can be a tough read for somebody reading in 21st century United States of America, just because a lot of what's written in this book is pretty foreign to us, not being people who have lived under a Jewish religious system. And yet I believe this book is important because it not only teaches us about the history of really the faith that Christianity grew out of, but it teaches us a lot about God. It teaches us a lot about his holiness and his attributes, and about how he thinks about things. And a lot of it feeds into what we understand about faith in Jesus. So I hope that this will be a great read for us as we make our way throughout this book over the next few weeks. Thinking about Leviticus, just share a few thoughts with you. Number one, this is the template that would be used for the tabernacle religious system. So just about everything we have here within Leviticus is going to tie into that religious system. One cool note that I heard one man say about Leviticus is that, as you think about the story of the Exodus, it took in a sense one night to get the people from being in Egypt to being out of Egypt. But now it's going to take a lot longer for God to get the Egypt out of the people. So many of the sacrifices that are mentioned here are going to help to cleanse the people and atone for the sins of the people, and to allow for fellowship to be present with them, even though as they struggle in various ways. So this is helping to get Egypt out of the people. And everything about Leviticus itself, just the name Leviticus sounds a lot like Levites, doesn't it? And this really is a handbook for the Levites. They would pay a lot of attention to this, and even just for Jewish young people in general. I think this was the first, from what I read, this is the first and heard, this is the first book that Jewish young people were given. Not Genesis, not Exodus, but Leviticus. It was important for them to understand the law of the Lord. And then the bulk of the material that is found here in Leviticus consists of divine speeches that Moses gave to the people. So it's not like the Exodus and Genesis where there's a lot of narrative portions. Probably one of the reasons that makes it hard to read is that it's not so much narrative based. It's much more you might call it the legalese of the law. But again, nonetheless, there's a lot of really important things mentioned here. And it's something that matters to the New Testament writers. It is quoted about 40 times in the New Testament, and it really does lay a solid theological groundwork for the Jewish faith. So with all that said, let me get Leviticus chapter 1 up on the screen for us so we can get to reading here together. Leviticus chapter 1 and verse number 1. Then Yahweh summoned Moses, which that word, that right there, summoning Moses and speaking to him is the way the Hebrew Bible titles this text. Whatever the Hebrew words would be for he spoke to Moses or he summoned Moses. That's what we have here within Leviticus. That Yahweh summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Speak to the Israelites and tell them, when any of you brings an offering to Yahweh from the livestock, you may bring your offering from the herd or the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he is to bring an unblemished male. He will bring it to the entrance to the tent of meeting so that he may be accepted by Yahweh. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so it can be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He is to slaughter the bull before Yahweh. Aaron's sons, the priests, are to present the blood and splatter it on all sides of the altar, that is, at the entrance to the tent meeting. Then he is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest will prepare a fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. Aaron's sons, the priests, are to arrange the pieces, the head and the fats, on top of the burning wood on the altar. The offerer is to wash its entrails and legs with water. Then the priest will burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. But if his offering for a burnt offering is from the flock, from sheep or goats, he is to present an unblemished male. He will slaughter it on the north side of the altar before Yahweh. Aaron's sons, the priest, will splatter its blood against the altar on all sides. He will cut the animal into pieces with its head and its fats, and the priest will arrange them on top of the burning wood on the altar. But he is to wash the entrails and legs with water. The priest will then present all of it and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. If his offering to Yahweh is a burnt offering of birds, he is to present his offering from the turtle doves or young pigeons. Then the priest is to bring it to the altar and will twist off its head and burn it on the altar. Its blood should be drained at the side of the altar. He will remove the digestive tract, cutting off the tail feathers, and throw it on the east side of the altar at the place for ashes. He will tear it open by its wings without dividing the bird. Then the priest is to burn it on top of the altar of burning wood. It is a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Chapter 2, verse number 1. When anyone presents a grain offering as an offering to Yahweh, it is to consist of fine flour. He is to pour olive oil on it, put frankincense on it, and bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest will take a handful of fine flour and oil from it, along with all its frankincense, and will burn this memorial portion of it on the altar, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. But the rest of the grain offering will belong to Aaron and his sons. It is the holiest part of the food offerings to Yahweh. When you present a grain offering baked in an oven, it is to be made of fine flour, either unleavened cakes mixed with oil or unleavened wafers coated with oil. If your offering is a grain offering prepared on a griddle, it is to be unleavened bread made of fine flour mixed with oil. Break it into pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. If your offering is a grain offering prepared in a pan, it is to be made of fine flour with oil. When you bring it to Yahweh, the grain offering made in any of these ways, when you bring it to Yahweh, the grain offering made in any of these ways, it is to be presented to the priest, and he will take it to the altar. The priest will remove the memorial portion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. But the rest of the grain offering will belong to Aaron and his sons. It is the holiest part of the food offerings to Yahweh. No grain offering that you present to Yahweh is to be made with yeast, for you are not to burn any yeast or honey as a food offering to Yahweh. You may present them to Yahweh as an offering of first fruits, but they are not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. You are to season each of your grain offerings with salt. You must not omit your grain offering. You must not omit from your grain offering, the salt of the covenant with your God. You are to present salt with each of your offerings. If you present a grain offering of first fruits to Yahweh, you are to present fresh heads of grain, crushed kernels roasted on the fire for your grain offering of first fruits. You are to put oil and frankincense on it. It is a grain offering. The priest will then burn some of its crushed kernels and oil with all its frankincense as a food offering to Yahweh. And that is Leviticus chapter 1 and Leviticus chapter 2. All right, so thinking about these two separate offerings here, we have The first one being a burnt offering, the second one being a grain offering. First, considering the burnt offering, here's an important question for us. And really, these offerings help us to answer this question. And the question is this: how can impure, sinful creatures find access to God's presence? That's a very good question. We noticed back in Exodus the great significance of Yahweh's holiness, and thinking about his glory and the taking off of sandals and the inability of just anybody to approach his mountain, the fact that Moses had to set up his tent outside the camp whenever God was mad at them for the golden calf incidents. All of this just goes to and leads us to this understanding that God's holiness matters. So how can sinful, impure, mortal creatures approach a perfectly pure, perfectly holy, immortal God? How can that be the case? Well, the answer, given broadly, the broad answer to this general question would be by means of sacrifice. Sacrifice is the means. So we think about this first sacrifice, this burnt offering. This was a general offering. It was a regularly given offering. It was a voluntary offering. So there does not seem to be a set schedule for these burnt offerings. This was an offering that was made to make fellowship possible. And it shows from the offerer's perspective a desire to be pure and to be reconciled to God. This sacrifice, as the text says in verse number 4, was made on his behalf to make atonement for him. So it was an offering given to make sure that fellowship was available between the offerer and Yahweh. Yet for this particular sacrifice, the worshiper was really involved with it. As we read through there, we read about how the one who was offering this sacrifice would be a part of it, that he would, let me see if I can find it really quickly. Yeah, the offerer, he would lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering so that it would be accepted on his behalf. So he was very much involved here with this whole process. It wasn't that he just handed it off and took off home. No, he had to be involved in the slaughtering and sacrificing of this animal. Well, what animal was it? Well, there's different categories. You could give of a bull, you can give of a sheep or a goat, or you can give of a bird. So no one was excluded from being able to offer this sacrifice. Again, depending on your wealth level, you might not have a bull in order to sacrifice. You might not even have a goat or a sheep in order to sacrifice, but you would have enough to be able to produce a turtle dove and to offer that to Yahweh. But for this particular sacrifice, we need to make sure that we understand that it was totally consumed, that this consumed every bit of it. This is different, and I mentioned that because it's different from what we're going to see with the grain offering in chapter 2, because in chapter 2, a portion was given on the altar to God, but the rest of that was given to the priest, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. So for this particular offering, this first offering, this burnt offering, whether it be a bull, whether it be a sheep, a goat, a turtle dove, a young pigeon, all of it was offered to Yahweh. And as we see, let me count here. 1, 2, 3 times at least. 3 times it is recognized that this was a burnt offering, a fire offering of a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. Again, establishing peace, establishing fellowship, establishing reconciliation between the offerer and Yahweh. Now, as far as the grain offering goes, this offering, again, it was voluntary, although it would be offered on a somewhat regular basis, but it was done as an expression of gratitude and commitment between the offerer and Yahweh. And again, this could be offered in a few different ways. It could be offered cooked or uncooked. It'd be cooked in a griddle or in a pan, of various ways. But as we see in verse number 3 and verse number 10, I think that's it here. These 2 verses establish this, that these offerings, part of it would be given to Yahweh on the altar, but the other part would be given to the priest in order for them to eat of it. But this was also a sign of God's acceptance of this offering, because priests were consecrated people. Priests were, in a sense, holy space themselves, because they had been consecrated, because they had been purified, they had been ritually cleaned and washed. So they represented God. So for them to eat it then is what made this the holiest part of the fire offerings to the Lord, because it is his vessel that would be eating this food. And again, with this offering and some other ones as well, these offerings are what provided sustenance for the priest. They were fed based upon these offerings, and what a blessed position that would be. So in these first two offerings we look at in chapter 1 and chapter 2, again, the question is, how can impure sinful creatures approach the presence of a holy God? Well, it's through the means of sacrifice, because in both of these instances, they are giving up something of themselves. They're giving up value that they possess, whether it be in the form of an animal or whether it be in the form of the grain and the flour and the other things that went into these grain or meal offerings. They were given of themselves to God. They were sacrificing of themselves to God, and these are described as being pleasing aromas to Yahweh. And of course, for us too, we think about the fact that we are to offer our entire lives as offerings to God, as sacrifices to God, again, pleasing in his sight as well. So as we think about these offerings, know that we do not give these things. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of appreciative that we don't have to go through this process, because as you can tell, it was a bloody, nasty process. I mean, just thinking about what we see just in chapter 1 alone, the slaughtering, the sprinkling of blood, the entrails, just all of it. It was intense. And I'm thankful to not have to do that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that any less is required of us. We are to give our entire lives as sacrifices to God. And I hope that we take that seriously, and that we are constantly offering up ourselves to God for the benefits of reconciliation and peace and fellowship, to show our gratitude and our commitment to God in every way. We'll read about some more tomorrow as we get into the fellowship offering and the sin offering of chapters 3 and 4. Hope that you will tune in then as we read and discuss those as well. If you have any questions or comments about our first read in Leviticus, please feel free to leave those in the comments section below. Again, thanks for tuning in today. We'll be back at it again tomorrow on March the 18th, reading together in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. Hope to see you then. Take care and God bless.